Let me welcome you. I am Alan Winters. I'm Director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory. We are delighted to see everybody here. And thank you for coming and continuing to be interested in July 2019. You're all aware the UK is about to take sort of huge decisions about international trade policy, not just relationship with Europe, but possibly with nice Mr. Trump, and indeed 163 other countries around. And we hope that it's going to have a huge debate to go with those huge decisions, and we would like to contribute to that. And we are economists on the panel. UKTPO has lawyers, but we're all economists today. Economists generally believe that international trade has been a thoroughly good thing, but we all recognise that it has distributional consequences. And so while indeed it might be good for aggregate incomes, it might not be good for everyone. And if you're going to have a debate, and if you're going to try and create some support behind a liberal regime, you actually need to talk to people. And I won't mention names, but not an awful lot of talking perhaps has been going on. The paper we've got is not going to tell you who wins and loses from Brexit. It's not going to tell you who wins and loses from an agreement with the USA. It's going to talk about how we should think about those things, so conceptually, and what evidence we think we've got. In other words, what are the building blocks that we ought to have to try and make sense out of taking these decisions? There's a briefing paper you've got copies of, 3 authors. One, Ilona Savicka has now left UKTPO to work for the government. I'm afraid she can't be here, but Michael Gaziorek and Julia Mangton-Garrett are going to present the paper, and we're delighted to have Torsten Bell from the Resolution Foundation to sort of start the conversation off. I should tell everyone we are recording this session. When it comes to questions, we would like you to speak into the mic and say who you are, but otherwise, enjoy. And Michael is going to start. Michael.
Alan, thank you very much indeed for your introduction, and you've said some of the things that I was going to say anyway. By the way, I'm, as Alan said, Michael Gaziorek. I'm a trade economist working in the economics department and the UK Trade Policy Observatory at the University of Sussex. What this briefing paper is concerned with, it's explicitly concerned not with the overall welfare effects. As Alan rightly said, we generally think of trade as being a good thing in inverted commas. It increases the size of the pie, essentially. But it doesn't necessarily give everybody a bigger slice. So some people might get smaller slices of the pie as a result of international trade. Kind of what we're interested in here is exploring and understanding that better, thinking about why that might happen and what the empirical evidence is. And that's really important from a policy perspective. Take, for example, the share of manufacturing employment in the UK over the last 15 or 20 years. Around the late 1990s, it was around 14, 15%. Now the share of manufacturing employment is down to about 8%. If you look at the US, we know that employment in manufacturing has declined over a similar time period by about 6 million jobs. So that kind of raises the question, what role could have trade played in those sorts of declines, and what does the evidence suggest how big might have been the role of trade? And understanding that is obviously important in order to make good policy, and also in the face of perhaps more rising populist concerns about the gains from trade. So what we're going to do, I'm going to talk to you about the conceptual side, why we think that trade might lead to winners and losers. Julia's going to talk to us about the evidence, then I'll come back and talk a little bit about policy. So why is trade a good thing? I think it's an important question to ask at the very beginning, because if we understand kind of why trade takes place, why we think trade leads to those overall welfare gains, it helps us to understand who might be the winners and losers. And the answer to that question can essentially be found through 4 core channels, if you like. The first channel is that as we open up to international trade, we get changes in specialization. Look at this graph, which is in the briefing paper. This gives you, from the early 1960s to now, the share of cars in EU exports. So in the early 1960s, cars represented about 12% of, sorry, not EU exports, UK exports. Cars represented about 12% of UK exports. That went down to 4% by the mid-1980s, and now it's gone back up again to around 12%, and I will leave you to predict where you think that might go in the next few years. But the point is that we've seen big changes in specialization, and that's what we economists call comparative advantage. It means that we're relatively good at, and we trade with countries who are relatively good at other things. So one of the reasons why trade is a good thing, but leads to these winners and losers, is to do with these specialization effects. But even within that industry, the car industry, even if that line was steady, was constant over time, you might get quite a lot of within-industry changes taking place as you open up to international trade, because there's more competition from importing firms and access to export markets. What we'd probably expect to see is the more efficient firms would survive, the less efficient firm might not survive or would contract, and even if each firm's efficiency does not change, you get productivity rising because of these within-industry reallocation effect. So you get, if you like, churning within industries that's going on at the same time as the specialization, and that has winners and losers associated with it as well. The third channel is to do with productivity and growth. There's lots of good reason to expect that opening up to international trade enables firms to become more productive. And that leads to welfare gains. But as you become more productive, as a firm what does that mean? It means with the same inputs you can produce more. What are your inputs? Your inputs are your labor and your capital. So as you become more productive, you might need less labor. So increasing your productivity might reduce your demand for labor. And that, therefore, might lead to winners and losers. Of course, it doesn't necessarily mean that employment goes down, because as you become more productive, you might be increasing your quality, you might be lowering your prices. That might increase your aggregate demand. But the net effect will depend on those forces. And then the final channel I want to talk about is there's all sorts of reasons why we see agglomeration of firms locating sort of kind of close to each other. Think Silicon Valley, think finance industry in London, think the car industry in the West Midlands or a bit in the Northeast and so on. There's good reasons why this happens, either because you want to be close to markets, close to other firms, close to workers and so on. And as we open up to international trade, those forces for agglomeration are likely to change and lead to knock-on impacts. So who are the winners if you think about all those channels that I've gone through? Well, in that left-hand column, I've listed who the winners are. They're the consumers in the first instance. These are the people who probably see a bigger slice of that pie as a result of trade liberalisation. So the winners are the consumers who get goods in with lower prices, more variety, higher quality. So we all gain from the fact that we can import goods more cheaply, but we don't gain maybe by very much, but we gain by a little bit. Okay? Importing firms that buy intermediates to use in their production process either for sales at home or for export. If they can get cheaper, higher quality, more variety of intermediates, it's good for importing firms. Exporting firms may gain as they get access to export markets, and again with both the importing and export firms, it's not just the firms, but it's the workers potentially within those firms. And then, by extension, the regions with a higher concentration of any of the above are likely to be gainers as well. And then the flip side, I won't go through every single element, kind of applies when you think about the losers. Where we raise barriers to trade, think of Brexit, think of Trump's tariffs, that raises prices. Who loses out? The consumers lose out. The importing firms that have to buy the intermediates lose out. The exporting firms who might have less access to export markets. These are going to be the losers from trade in those circumstances. And again, the regions with a higher concentration of any of the above. Those forces, those impacts on winners and losers will impact differentially on household according to their consumption patterns. They're likely to impact differentially on industries depending on their underlying characteristics and types. So, for example, in earlier work that we did now over a year ago, when we were looking at manufacturing industries, we found that's probably likely to be the higher R&D intensive industries, higher skill industries that are more vulnerable to a Brexit shock in the UK. And they'll obviously impact differentially on different worker types, and Julia will say a little bit about this as well, be this by skill characteristics, age, or gender. Two more slides, then I'll hand over to Julia, two addenda, if you like. The first is, much of that story about why we trade, distribution impacts of trade, and the way trade economists often talk about this and think about this, it's kind of an importing story. But it's important to remember there are also gains from exporting, which may be to do with economies of scale, learning from export markets, competition, and so on, which are not unimportant, could well be very important in raising productivity and productivity growth in the economy, and indeed, we know of economies like Germany and so on being founded very much on an export-led growth model. The second addendum is that all these changes about winners and losers, I haven't said anything about timescales, how long it takes. So as some of you probably know, we've done some modelling work on impacts of Brexit, for example. One of the questions I'm often asked is, and how long is this going to take? What's the timescale? How many years is this? What are we talking about? Timescale is a tricky thing to pin down. So let me give you, some sort of conceptual stuff around that. There are immediate effects. There'll be winners and losers, for example, from Trump's trade war tariffs. Immediately, prices change. That means that consumers pay higher prices, firms buying intermediates pay higher. That's a kind of immediate effect. In the shorter run, you might think of, for example, all the uncertainty around Brexit, which is where firms are thinking about how to adjust, who to buy from, who to sell from, and so on. That's impacting on trade already, but it's a little bit more nebulous. It's not quite so immediate. In the medium run, you can think of the last 10 or 15 years. We've seen this big rise of China in the world economy, big increase in the share of Chinese imports in UK trade, US trade, and so on. And that's led to some changes, led to winners and losers, if you like, and think of that as the medium term. And in the longer run, think of the Industrial Revolution, think of the current technological process leading to automation and globotics. These are really long-run transformational changes which are going to impact on who gains and loses as we engage in international trade. Thank you. Let me hand over to Julia.
So I will try to give some overview of what some of the key findings in the literature is on winners and losers. And I won't go into great detail, you can find more in the paper, but just to give you some flavour. But starting off, I should say that the literature in this field is very big, and we're by no means claiming to cover it all, but we're covering what we think is a representative sample of the literature. And we've limited this to looking at the impact on developed countries, and we're looking primarily at within-country impacts rather than cross-country effects. And we can look at this through the impact on people, so that covers both consumers and workers, and impact on places, where, as I said, we're looking mainly at the within-country effects. So starting off with the impact on consumers, as Michael said, they are perhaps some of the most obvious winners of trade, because lowering trade barriers, firstly, lowers prices. And there's quite a lot of evidence, there's some evidence on this. For example, on the overall side, it's been found that real incomes in countries like the UK and the US could have been much lower in the absence of trade. So for the UK, they estimate that real incomes could be something up to 33% lower in the absence of trade. But it's also true at the sectoral level. So a study looking at specifically at the textile and clothing industry found that following the phase-out of the agreement on textiles and clothing in 1995, in the years following this, prices fell quite dramatically for clothing and textiles. In the UK, they fell by around 50% over the period 1996 to 2005. And this graph here gives some indication of this, where it plots the UK retail price index for women and children's outerwear from 1995 to 2009, and you can see relative to the 1995 price level, prices are falling quite dramatically. But consumers also benefit through getting access to more variety of products and better quality products. So it's estimated for the US that the US could have gained something like 2.6% of GDP over a 30-year period from being able to import more varieties of goods for consumers. And for the UK, it's been shown that the free trade agreements that were implemented by the EU over the period 93 to 2013, they increased the quality of UK imports by around 26%, and they reduced the quality adjusted prices by about 19%. And although all consumers tend to benefit from increased trade, lower income consumers could benefit more. And that's because lower income consumers tend to concentrate their spending more on relatively traded goods. So for example, low income consumers tend to spend a larger share of their income on food, whereas, which are more traded, whereas higher income consumers spend more on services, which are less traded. So that's looking at the consumers, but what about the workers? Well, workers can be affected both through changes in employment and changes in wages. And looking first at employment, as Michael's already said, quite a lot of the literature on this is looking particularly at manufacturing employment. And that's because over the last decades or so, many developed countries have seen a drastic decline in the manufacturing share of employment. And it's happened at the same time as trade patterns have shifted from developed countries trading primarily with other developed countries to trading more with developing countries, and particularly through the rise of China as a major exporter in the late 1990s onwards. And it sparked the question, to what extent has trade been a driver in these manufacturing job losses that we've seen? And research has shown that competition, particularly import competition from China, can explain some of these manufacturing job losses. For the UK, it's estimated that up to around 20% of the manufacturing job losses could be explained by import competition from China. And some quite influential work looking at the local labour markets have shown that there were larger reductions in manufacturing employment and wages for workers in regions that were more exposed to import competition from China. And that's not only true for the US, it's also been found to hold in countries like Norway, UK, and France. But those job losses in import-competing sectors should be balanced against potential job gains in export-oriented sectors. So there's evidence for Germany, for example, that shows that, yes, there were job losses in import-competing manufacturing sectors, but these were more than offset by job gains in export-oriented manufacturing sectors or units. And for the US, there's evidence that shows that even within the same firms, their import-competing units would shrink, but the export-oriented units would gain, and as firms reorganize and take advantage of that, total manufacturing employment could actually increase. And even if that doesn't happen, then its services export have gained job losses large enough to compensate for the manufacturing job losses. So that's looking at employment, but we might also be interested in exploring whether trade has had any impact on different wages between low-skilled and high-skilled workers. And going back to the studies that look at the impact of import competition from China, it's been shown that low-skilled or low-wage workers, manufacturing workers, were particularly hit by the import competition from China, both in terms of losses of earnings and employment. And there's also evidence that shows that offshoring to low-income countries particularly affects low-skilled occupations, whereas the growing services exports particularly benefit high-skilled and high-income jobs. And there's also some evidence that shows that increased import competition can induce within firms skill upgrading within manufacturing firms. And then I'll just touch on these very briefly. There's more on this in the paper, but it's just to say that so far we looked a lot at differences in wages between sectors, but there's also true that trade can play a part in wage inequality between firms in the same industry, because exporting firms tend to be bigger and pay higher wages than non-exporting firms. And there's also some evidence that suggests that, particularly for high-income countries, the gender wage gap could decrease with increased trade through a combination of a reduction in discrimination and increase in demand for female labour. Just a health warning, though, to say that, yes, the literature suggests that trade can play some part in creating winners and losers in the labour market, but it's not all about trade. Increased productivity growth was actually shown to be explain the majority, over 80% of the US manufacturing job losses. And technological change, particularly computerization, has been a key contributor, much more so than trade, to the rising skill premium. So moving on to the impact on places, this is quite complicated and the effects can be less clear. Changes in trade impacts differently on different regions, depending firstly on which industries and sectors are located where, But it also, as Michael's already said, can change the agglomeration incentives of where businesses want to locate in the future. But it can be difficult to predict the impact of trade at the regional level. And there are also many other factors at play here. And we can see that by looking, comparing these two maps here. So the left-hand side gives a sense of the geographical inequality in the UK. It compares the mean weekly wages of each area relative to the average UK wage. And the darker red shows the poorer, relatively poorer regions. And the right-hand side map, it's using data from a paper by Foliani and Riley, who kindly share their data with us, and it shows which UK regions were most exposed to import competition from China, where the darker red shows the more exposed regions. And looking at where the darker red areas are in both maps, the main sort of message is there's no obvious correlation here. The areas which are relatively poorer are not necessarily the ones that were more exposed to import competition from China. So yes, trade can impact regional income, but it's clearly not the only factor. There are many other factors at play. But looking at some of those direct impacts of trade, there's some evidence that shows the proximity to the markets you trade with matter, because things like transport costs matter. So, for example, following the UK's accession to the European Economic Communities, there was a reorientation of activity towards the ports in the southeast, because they were closer to mainland Europe. And similar thing has been found in Mexico. When Mexico liberalized its trade, activity shifted closer to the border with the US. And there's also some evidence on these agglomeration effects that show, particularly for industries that trade perhaps in more difficult markets where they need more specialized knowledge or contacts in the markets abroad, that incentivizes exporters to agglomerate, to make information pooling easier. And finally, there's also some evidence that if exports expand, that creates jobs in the tradable sectors. But those extra jobs in the tradable sectors also leads to more jobs in non-tradable sectors. Because as employment in the tradable sectors increase, people have more disposable income, they spend money on things like restaurants and retail and real estate, so employment in those sectors increase. And for the US, it's been found, and that's what we call the local employment multiplier effect. And for the US, it's been shown that for every 10 additional tradable jobs in a region, another 16 non-tradable jobs are created. And similarly for the UK, there's also these multiplier effects going on. They've been estimated to be slightly smaller, but for every 10 tradable jobs, that induces something like 6 additional non-tradable jobs. So not only do the regions that export benefit through more tradable jobs, they also benefit through more non-tradable jobs in the wider economy. And I'll hand back over to Michael.
Okay, so I just want to finish off with a few reflections on policy. What I think is pretty obvious, I hope is obvious from what I've said and what Julia's been saying, is that why trade takes place, there are various reasons. The way trade takes place is quite varied, and the impact, therefore, is quite complex. And that makes policy making complicated as well. There are no easy solutions here. The impact of trade on an economy, on the winners and losers, is inherently complex. So there is no one-size-fits-all policy. Getting policy right is tricky. It's not easy, okay? And it's quite easy to get policy wrong, and in so doing, to create further distortions. Think about the losers, the types of losers that there might be, and what sorts of policy responses there could be out there. Well, one type of instrument that one could think about using is, for example, you've got a sudden import surge, or you think another country has been engaging in some form of unfair trade policy, is some form of trade defense instrument, trade remedies, and so on. I think we would caution against it's too easy to switch to say, let's use trade defenses. Think of what Donald Trump is doing. A lot of that is saying, okay, these are safeguard measures, this is national security. It gets very easy to use this as an excuse to levy protection. It's quite contentious in the World Trade Organization. It's quite difficult to prove injury, and it's far from obvious that it necessarily helps the industries in question. I mean, it might do, but it's not obvious that it would. Alternative policies are focused more on the workers, although they could also be focused on the firms. So there are trade adjustment assistance programs. In America, it's called the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, and it can be targeted either at workers, at individuals, or indeed at firms. It offers things like wage insurance, retraining, information about job opportunities, and so on. And recent evidence on those sorts of programs is a really good podcast by Chad Baum that came out a couple of weeks ago on this. The most recent evidence on this suggests that the trade adjustment program in America has been effective in getting workers back into work more quickly in comparison to those that weren't. Okay? Other issues that policymakers might consider to think about the losers, if you know that, for example, you currently have a highly protected industry, liberalizing trade dramatically, quickly, is inevitably going to make those impacts greater, faster, and so on. So you might want to liberalize more slowly. Another point that emerges from some of the empirical work, and as Julia said, we can't by any means discuss everything here, is that adjustment to trade shocks, as there is a trade shock, such as a China trade shock, the way firms and workers adjust can take a long time. It's not as if adjustment is necessarily easily. So the consequences can be felt for some time, in particular when there's a rapid shock. So thinking about slightly more gradual policies, depending on what type of liberalization is being proposed, is possibly sensible. And, I guess it goes without saying that the reverse also applies. So a rapid no-deal exit from the EU come October the 31st is likely to be much more painful than a much more slowly managed exit from the EU, for example. And then there are policies that you might want to do to improve the attractiveness of disadvantaged regions. It might be to do with infrastructure, it might be fiscal incentives, it might be training opportunities. The winners, well, they tend to be the consumers, so you don't necessarily need policies for consumers here. But clearly the government in the UK and many governments believe in trying to promote exports. And that ties back to my slide earlier about there are gains from exporting over and above the gains derived from just simple comparative advantage in importing and so on. And so there's potentially a role for governments to help firms to be more successful in export markets. But as economists, we would argue the position one tends to take on this is there's a good reason for the good reasons for interventions where there is market failure. If firms can export anyway, why would governments intervene? But then there are good reasons why there might be elements of market failure. Firms might have imperfect information. There might be spillovers between firms. There might be entry barriers or discriminatory practices that are taking place in particular markets where a bit of diplomatic intervention, a bit of discussion and so on might help in promoting more exports. So it's not I'm saying there is no role for governments to encourage exports. There potentially is, but probably in the face of some sort of market failure, which might also be financial. It might be by providing export credit insurance and so on, which firms might struggle to get for whatever reason. But obviously the response will depend on the nature of the barrier. Okay, so my final slide, and then hand over to Torsten and then to the discussion. A final slide on policy responses. Clearly in the short run policy responses are going to be very different to long-run policy responses. In the short run, one is really thinking about what are the obstacles for firms? How can we help them overcome those obstacles? What are the challenges that they're facing? Is there a role for government here? And how can we help, when we're thinking about losers, workers adjust to shocks that they may be facing? Things like wage insurance programs, for example. In the long run, there's a completely sort of different conceptual role for policy. It's about the evolving industrial structure of the economy, it's the evolving comparative advantage, and the role that the government plays in that, as opposed to simply letting market forces determine that. And this is more to do with perhaps nudging industries, nudging things in the right direction. It's not necessarily about picking winners and losers. So it starts to tie in much more closely and in very complicated ways to industrial policy, to regional policy. Think about, again, in the UK, part of the UK government's industrial strategy are these sectoral deals. Conceptually, they could fit into this sort of longer run, nudge-based approach to evolving comparative advantage. In general, I would argue that the aim should be that what you want to do is to provide an environment, this is to do with information, incentives, financing, infrastructure, to make it easier for firms and industries to emerge, to have a long-run planning horizon, and to seize the opportunities that are available in the longer term. And where you get shocks, policy needs to think about how to facilitate adjustment for those facing dislocation. Partly because that's good for the economy. The quicker, the easier you can adjust, the better it is for the long-run economic growth, but it's also good in terms of equity and social justice. And on that note, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So, Torsten Bell from the Revolution Foundation.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks, Alan. Alan threatened to introduce me as the representative of the losers on the panel this morning, which I thought was a bit harsh, but we'll try and do some justice. There's lots in the report, I'm sure you've all read it, and we focused mainly on the economics of trades. I'm not going to repeat a lot of that. I thought I'd instead make a few remarks on the political economy of it, and then on where you finished on the policy, where we come out on that, thinking about quite practically policy for the UK today rather than policy at any time in any place, which the report would help you think about, but it's probably less relevant to people trying to do with it at the moment. Now, on the politics, I think it's worth just starting with, look, political cycles come and go, and policies ebb and flow in and out of political debates. Yeah, so the late 90s, public services, the level of spending on them was the key. 2003, there was this war thing. Right now, crime is heading back up the political agenda in a way it hasn't been for the last 15 years. Now, trade is a really interesting and different case study, which is a policy largely coming from nowhere in the political debate to being right up there in an area where no one spent any time discussing it, and suddenly we're having to take very big decisions about our future. And it's not that trade hasn't been there, trade has just now re-emerged after a kind of 30-year gap with no one either thinking or talking about it. Now, that is the context into which reports like this are really helpful, because the danger, as any of you that work in Whitehall, I can see a few faces here, that do is, remember, nobody reads anything, okay? That's the backdrop to most things in life. No one reads anything. That's particularly true of academic papers. And so it's fine. And so the dangers of that are, one, we've got this re-emerging issue. Everyone has forgotten the history. It's not like rows about free trade agreements versus customs unions with the European countries is actually new. It's just that we stopped talking about it for 40 years, and we're literally back exactly where we were sometime around the late 50s. So they've forgotten the history, and they won't have read the literature, because the way Whitehall does literature is that they have osmosed enough of it that there's a shared institutional memory, even though no one's actually read the papers. So those two things don't exist in this case, which is why 16 pages summarising a bit of them is very valuable indeed, and that hopefully helps us avoid policy-based evidence rather than evidence-based policy. So then, what more helpfully does this tell us about the economics and the political economy? So first of all, the paper says at some point, I think, one way to think about trade is just that it's one example of economic change. There are lots of other ones, it is one big one, but policy can change. Policy towards climate change will lead to big economic changes. You can get them from preference shifts. If I gave everybody in the room £1 today, they would spend more of it on services and less of it on buying stuff than they would have done 20 years ago. That's a preference change. As we get richer, we want to spend more money on health as we get richer and less money on other things. Commodity price shifts can drive economic change in very big ways. And the one that everyone really talks about, but is again only one other one, is tech. Okay, those are examples of big drivers of economic change. So in what ways maybe trade is just the same as every other economic change, the policy response should be the same, and we shouldn't get upset. That is definitely not true in political economy terms, at least. I'll come back to economics in a second. I'm not giving you a conclusive answer to why it's not the same, but here's two reflections. One is that trade is different because someone did it. Okay? An active decision was made to change a tariff, to change a quota, to change a barrier, that meant that something happened to the firm you worked at. And that is, although tech, someone obviously invented it, it's very diffuse where it comes from. It almost feels like it's kind of just history rolling on. In fact, lots of economic models actually treat tech as manna from heaven. It just appears from somewhere. And that probably does change how people feel about it. The second is that unlike, even though all of those economic changes have winners and losers, in some ways, trade is different in the sense that somebody else feels like somebody else is winning because it's more of it's thought of as an us and them debate, and it feels like someone in politics you've never met has taken a decision, and it's having a really big effect on the thing you care about, on the loser side, not on the winner side, and somebody else it feels like is winning, and they probably aren't someone you're ever going to meet. And so that does mean it's a different political economy. So the first thing is that you do get different political economies to different kinds of economic change. The second thing is the political economy of trade is very different in different countries, which you understand we don't focus on in the report, but is worth reflecting. Like, we are not the US, and I do sometimes worry that we talk as if we are. And so countries that are very open to trade tend to think of it more like tech. It feels more inevitable, and so the political opposition is much more muted. So like Sweden and the UK have totally different attitudes to trade to the United States. Because if the US wanted to be an autarky, it's kind of big enough that it could be, its share of trade is much, much lower, and that has a big effect. And we shouldn't be too dominated by the US literature, which, because this is an economics discussion, the literature is totally US dominated. That's how you have a career in academia these days in economics. That doesn't mean that all that matters is the US. And in lots of ways, I do worry on some of the literature you refer to that's trying to apply the China shock methodologies to the UK. A lot of that is really just telling me what the industrial mix is of different parts of the UK. I don't really believe it shows me in the way that it's, the causal link to the China shock is not as strong as, but let's park that as a techie point. So my basic point is, one, yes, shocks. There are lots of different kinds of shocks. They're in some ways similar. There are winners, there are losers. In general, churn is giving us high productivity and overall gains, but some people lose out. But the political economy is different, one, versus other changes, and two, between countries. And having that in your head when we think about the politics is really important. Then there's just a few brief policy reflections, again, split into those two categories. So things that are generally good policies for managing economic change, and then things that are more trade specific. So look, and in some ways, if you're a policymaker, so this report is really useful in the sense that it gives you a quick summary of a large sweep of literature. The danger, as everyone that spends their time in our world will know, is that when you do literature reviews, the danger is you say, well, on this paper found this, but this paper found this. And if you're a policymaker at that point, you've just left the room because there's literally nothing you can take from that. So it's really important, I think, for us to help policymakers drive to things they can actually do, because there's no point worrying about everything you first. So first of all, change has losers, as the report rightly says. That in of itself is not the most important thing. The most important thing is that losing can be very long-lasting. Very. If there were losers but it was really quick, that would be fine. That's how we deal with like kids when they're upset about you've taken something off them. They're going to get something else good in 5 seconds and their memory forgets. If what you're really saying is this economic change is going to take place, it's going to be good for the country as a whole, but for your town, it means 30 years of decline, it is not massively surprising that people are not liking that. And so having that, and that is true at a local level, and that's the story of the 1980s, huge economic change, almost nothing to do with trade, based largely on sectoral change happening very, very fast in the 1980s. That is actually what's lying behind the chart. The reason why the China shock doesn't explain the poor areas of the UK is that the 1980s that's the big economic change that's happened to us. The rest of it is small fry. Like, yes, China's huge surge in imports is massive in that world, but it's tiny compared to the economic change being driven by huge industrial change over that longer period. So then what can we actually do? Right, the first to say is, so redistribution is really important, but not for just for the obvious reason. So it's really important because if you have a shock of any kind of economic change, it leads to losers. Supporting that income adjustment is what the tax and benefit system is for. That's literally what it does. When we talk about automatic stabilisation for the economy as a whole, at the individual level, that is, if you lose some of your income, your living standards don't fall as much as your earnings do because the tax benefit system kicks in to give you a good chunk of that. And obviously, one of the problems recently over the last 10 years is we've made that weaker than it was. We're doing less redistributing for people in these kind of situations than we were previously. The second thing to say about redistribution is it's really important that we don't just think about it at the individual level. You've got to think about local economic demand. So the challenge is what you do not want, and I'll come back to this in trade in a second specifically, is an area narrowly, heavily hit by an economic change of whatever kind, and that you do not provide demand support in that area, because if you lose the big factory and you don't provide demand support, what you lose is everything else that's dependent on it, for which there is no need. That is about what is the level of other people buying the stuff. Is someone going into the cafe that the workers were previously going into? That stuff is what leads to spirals of decline. That is the lesson from the 1980s. Right, secondly, on skills. Now, in trade discussions, all of the discussion focuses on retraining, largely. Now, I agree, there is one paper recently that does encourage us to slightly rethink what is a consensus view, which is most trade adjustment schemes have not been hugely successful. I don't actually have a view on, I've not spent enough time on that data to have a view on whether that one paper makes me reassess my entire view about retraining. But retraining schemes outside of just trade policy in general are not massive successes. Like I cannot tell you there's a country that's got a really good approach to retraining where it's good value for money, the people love it, and it's all a triumph, okay? Particularly where it's really kind of discretionary, as in someone like sees a problem happening, which by the way Whitehall will always miss, triggers a thing to happen and someone goes to help them. That doesn't tend to work. So what can work, I also have no faith in Britain. So there is a thing called the National Retraining Scheme. I don't know if anyone in the room's heard of it. It doesn't really exist yet, but we've been spending money chatting about it. I have no faith in the British state successfully implementing that over the next 10 years, while it's also trying to reform our apprenticeship system, our T-levels for technical education, and I would prefer they got those other two things right. So retraining in principle, yes, but for reasons I'll come back to, I'm sceptical. But what does matter is the base level of skills. People's ability to cope with change is based on their human capital, and we have done not enough over the last 10 years to keep the pace of increase in human capital has slowed in Britain since about the turn of the millennium. So we had this big surge in higher education uptake in the 1990s, and then we have broadly, although everyone keeps saying, oh, everyone goes to university these days and all that, the actual pace of increase has slowed significantly in recent years, and that is why you should be focusing on your basic training, your T-levels and others, so that you've got a population coming through who's more highly trained at each point. That makes us better able to cope. Third, mobility. So if you were having this conversation in Germany rather than in the US, people would be saying, where's your scheme to help people move when their area gets hit by an economic shock? There's none of that in the debate in the UK. We did used to have a scheme, I'm trying to think, probably in the early 80s, I'm thinking back, that would have tried to provide that level of support, but we don't do any of that. That might have been okay in some phases, but just think about somebody who, really highly trained worker, who lives in Hartlepool. So they've definitely got skills that could be used elsewhere if their job goes, okay? But our housing costs in Britain, particularly house prices, have stretched over time. So more productive areas, their house prices have grown faster than less productive areas. So your ability to move up the productivity chain by place is now very highly constrained. If you were a 55-year-old in a nice house, in a less productive but you had a good job part of the country, the idea that however large the pay rise is, you can move to somewhere for another job if it's further up the productivity chain is for the birds. That's not possible. It's just you haven't got 500 grand to pay, unless you're prepared to trade down a lot on your house. And the one thing we know about Brits is they won't do that because they're completely irrational about their housing. So mobility needs to be part of your agenda. And then just lastly on place, because as I said, people don't actually in practice move, I think we probably need to think a lot harder. So economic geographies change, okay? So that does mean that some places face very difficult situations. Sometimes there are answers. So places like Barnsley, Burnley, Oldham can be much better connected to places of GVA growth today, to the big cities near them. That is definitely achievable. It should be a political priority. It can be done. That is, we cannot just pretend that can be done for everywhere. So like Blackpool, that is not going to happen. Blackpool is not going to be connected to GVA growth in the middle of Manchester in any meaningful way. There are other ways it can generate growth, but it's not via the way that most of the country will see living standards rise in the years ahead. And in those places, I think we've just got to accept our job is to make all of Britain a nice place to live in. It doesn't matter if your place isn't at the cutting edge of the economy, but you will have a decent hospital, it will look nice, there will be decent housing, and it will have decent transport links. And in some ways, that is, we spend all our time being like universal basic income, all this other radical stuff. Right? We haven't been doing the basics. Give people a nice place to live, and then people can then make their choices. So some people don't want to live in the really busy, bustling place where humans have preferences, that's fine. But it's not an equal opportunity. If one, nobody has the opportunity to move if they want to, and two, those that don't want to move are then told not only are you not at the cutting edge of productivity growth, you're not at the cutting edge of a nice place to live. That's like for the birds. Right, then just some closing words on trade-specific policies. I basically broadly agree with everything you said as a consensus from the literature. All I would add is, and this comes through from the paper, is uncertainty about impacts is really high. Okay. So in the same way that in the UK we were totally wrong about migration levels post-2004, in the US and everywhere we were completely wrong about the level of Chinese import penetration. Nobody was close. That was some for policy reasons, but it's also just, we're just not very good at predicting complicated things that have sectoral and regional effects. And that, in of itself, should just make us think about the pace at which we do it. Because you can't promise people what's going to happen, and we should be more aware of our lack of knowledge. And also, because we're aware of our lack of knowledge about where the losers will materialise, will it be problematic this time or not? Because lots of trade liberalisations don't lead to problematic losers, particularly, for example, if they're not geographically focused. If you have diffuse losers across the whole country, that's much more easy to manage than if you just destroy a town's productive capacity overnight. So there's a pace question. I think that is also particularly true because the competitiveness of places is path dependent. So it is not like the model tells you, we've got this capital in a place, this human capital, so this will be the level of productivity. In the real world, places, firms are real things, institutions, ecosystems. Their ability to adapt their competitiveness to a changed world, it depends on the nature of the shock that happens to them. And so you need to think about the pace at which you do it. And then my last point on trade-specific policy is one of the challenges to the paper, and this is more a challenge to the entire literature in this area, is all the literature is written saying, largely, one, prove that a liberalisation is good for aggregate outcomes, which we all believe, but two, that there are some losers from liberalisation, and then what should we do about it, as per our discussion. Maybe that's the policy question we face today. I'm not sure it is. I think the policy question is more likely to be, should we deliberalise trade in certain ways? In which ways? How should we do it? Are there losers? And that is, some of the things are clearly symmetrical. So the effect on productivity and things is probably reasonably symmetrical. But the effect on losers, the political economy of that are not the same. And so what people are going to be really asking, because yes, there may be at some point a trade deal with the United States, maybe. There won't be one with India. Really what we're asking ourselves is, how much do we want to deliberalise trade with our main trading partner over the next 15 years? And everything else, every other decision we're going to take in trade policy is going to be absolutely tiny. And so that is the policy question that really matters. And then just two thoughts to close. The paper's really good at reminding us there are winners as well as losers, which is really important in these conversations, that we don't actually forget that. It does obviously miss some of the biggest winners, which is the entire of the Global South, or at least good chunks of the Global South. So you don't want to forget that. There's a moral reason to liberalise, not just a UK reason to liberalise. And the second thing is that it's all of our jobs to help policymakers actually make decisions rather than just telling them what's in the literature. So maybe let's force ourselves to, even when it is on balance, not absolutely clear what the literature tells us, you guys are in a better place than lots of other people to help people weigh those ambiguities up, because it turns out life is ambiguous.
Thank you very much, Torsten. We have a few minutes for questions. We have a microphone, so please make questions concise, and then I will ask the panel to deal with them. So, David over here.
David Henning, thank you for the interesting presentations. Two thoughts or questions. One, really triggered by what Torsten just said, is actually any prospect of significant liberalisation coming anywhere globally? In fact, we've already reduced tariffs, so what is the prospect of significant liberalisation? Or in fact, this is reflective of China in particular, and that liberalisation that has happened. Number two, regulations, not really mentioned here. If there is going to be liberalisation, what role, we're increasingly, all trade is regulated. What role does regulation have in global trade and winners and losers?
Okay, thank you. Does anyone want to comment briefly? There's one microphone.
Sorry, so if I understood your first question, David, is what is the scope for more substantial trade liberalisation?
Is there really scope now in the future for all that significant trade liberalisation, or was it, we've had it with China, that was the global trade liberalisation that we really had, and now there's not going to be a similar shock in the future?
So I think that your two questions are actually related, because to the extent that there is scope for further trade liberalisation, it is largely going to be around regulations. So that's the link between your questions. And to the extent that there's scope for further trade liberalisation, there is not much with regard to manufacturing goods, or there's less, so not much is not the right way of putting it, there's less with regard to that. There is scope for further trade liberalisation in services, potentially. But that's trickier, as we all know.
Sheila.
Thank you, Sheila Page. Two related aspects of a question. Have you looked at whether there's as an analytical exercise, it wouldn't be a policy one, between the sorts of policies, the sorts of which are advocated on trade and the sorts that are advocated on redistribution. Because that's always struck me as the weakness of the let's get trade right and then redistribute mantra. If the sorts of people who liberalize trade are the sorts of people who wouldn't be caught dead doing redistribution, or vice versa, then we may need to consider the two policies together from a political economy. And following up the asymmetry point, are these forces different for deliberalization compared to liberalization? The types of political economy are certainly going to be different. I think the losses will be differently distributed. And I think that this may raise, Michael, a question about fast versus slow and change it. Because it's one thing to say, if you're going to be restricting, let's postpone the losses as long as possible, because we know there's going to be a net loss as well as individual losses. But I've never quite understood why it should be right to postpone liberalization when you know there's going to be a net gain, when you know you are hurting those people who will gain by postponing it. So is there a difference in policy implication in terms of speed?
Michael,
So the answer to your first question is whether we've compared those two. Frankly, no, we haven't. If I focus on your second question as to is the policy response different depending on the speed at which you liberalise? It's hard to give a general answer, but my gut feeling is that yes, it clearly will be different, because it's not just that you're trying to slow down the process of adjustment, it's to do with the path dependency that Torsten mentions. If you do something very rapidly, very quickly, you're in danger of, there are multiple equilibria here, essentially. You're in danger of forcing change in one particular route where it needn't go that way. So by doing things in a slightly more measured fashion, that changes the policy responses. I don't know if Torsten wants to.
Torsten, please.
Those are two great questions. On the liberalisation versus redistribution, so my partial answer, I'll come to why it's a cop-out in a second, but my partial answer is I wouldn't think about it as is the person doing the liberalisation the person doing the redistribution? For the reasons you say, they may well not be, because the policy response to liberalisation is not to do more redistribution. The policy response to being a modern capitalist economy with a decent level of economic churn, and we're at the top end of churn amongst particularly the bottom 2/3 of our income distribution, is that you need to have an active redistribution all the time. It's always going. How much it's called upon is then determined by the level of economic churn driven by your liberalisation decision. So I don't require the politician doing the liberalisation to also be the one increasing the redistribution. I just want a lot of redistribution going on across the whole system all the time. On the asymmetry of is it best to, well, I think I'd leave it your path dependency answer, which is a good reason for not doing that.
Okay, thank you. Tammy.
Hi, Tammy Holmes, Department for International Trade. It's quite easy to characterise workers in contracting sectors as losers. Would you characterise workers in expanding sectors as winners?
Potentially, yes. If an expanding sector is employing more workers, then those workers that are employed in that expanding export sector are winners. If the expanding export sector is becoming more productive and is paying workers higher wages, then they are winners.
Torsten, do you want
You don't seem convinced.
I was thinking of existing workers, and is it an unambiguous answer?
So I'll give you an example. So the hard case here is there's only two factories in the country, okay? I do a trade deal. The worker from one factory loses their job, but goes into an exactly equally paid job in the factory next door. Are they a winner or are they a loser? Under your metric, they're a winner. Under our main metric, they're a loser because they also lost their job. And my answer to that, which is slightly relevant to your second question, but given that you've given me an excuse to come back to it, is human beings obviously we have an asymmetry to losing versus winning. As in our degree of antipathy to losing is much bigger than our wish to win. That is definitely true with jobs. Okay, so that is why I think there is an ambiguity but obviously there's more than two companies in the country.
Yeah, I can't resist joining in. I mean, it partly depends on how you think the labour market works. If we've got just one single pool of labourers who get the same wage wherever they work, in fact, the effect of any single bit of liberalisation will be very small. But if there's anything specific, be it skills or location, then indeed the losses and gains are more concentrated and we'll start to notice them. Ian.
Thank you. My background is investment banking. I've continually over 30, 40 years looked at sectors. And when you looked at sectors or particular industry lines, you immediately see the winners and losers. And often one's job as an investment banker is to identify a takeover target who's not doing very well, where you think additional capital, additional skills will make it work. My fear is, and if I may encourage you all, that the link between your economic analysis, the sectors, the 20 major sectors, and then the constituency analysis which Alan and your team did, which allows to identify 650 local markets, we have to tie that in with looking at each sector and knowing who the winners and losers are, even within the sector, because you can have the very contradictory appearing fact that the winner takes all. You can have the most efficient firm in a particular sector, all the other ones fall, and you have one remaining specialist in that field who dominates the market. And they're the winners, but they are located in a specific location with specific premises, specific factories. How can we link this together? I mean, that is my recommendation. And I was stunned to find that the Treasury Select Committee team talks very rarely to the BEIS committee team. And so BEIS produced analysis of Brexit effects. The Treasury produces analysis of... But the tie between sectors where we know, everybody knows in investment banking who the winners are. Look at Apple. So how to tie these things together so that what you're saying generally makes sense, but can be applied to particular sectoral implications. There's a young lady here from Delphi Technologies, for example, the car manufacturing sector.
Let me come back to that. Right. So, you want to respond to that?
No, I have a response to that.
No. We agree. It's complicated. Okay. Jonathan.
Thank you, Richard Given, Department for International Trade. I'm really enjoying the discussion. I spent most of my career working on active labour market policy, and now I'm working on trade, and I think Torsten's perspective is really useful. I think from my knowledge of Whitehall, and this is an observation and a question really, I think it's almost impossible to specifically develop a social welfare response to trade. And I think what Torsten's saying is that actually we need a social welfare system that can address the economic shocks. In practice, the first response of the social welfare system to a trade shock is when someone from the Department of Business calls the head of Job Centre Plus and says, can I have a crisis response unit to try to help these workers who are about to lose their jobs next week? So, I mean, I think the point is, I think we need to be getting their social welfare system part sorted out. My pessimism is that there's a complete lack of political consensus on the investment decisions and the priorities needed to reform our social welfare system, and that's how we've got into the situation that we're in.
Okay. Torsten, do you...
I agree with that.
Okay.
Obviously.
Yeah. Okay. No.
Yeah, just to say that I agree with that as well. I mean, I think that what is needed is a system of adjustment, assistance and redistribution that isn't just specific to trade, because there's all sorts of shocks that hit an economy, and some of those happen to be trade related, some don't. And we need to have a sensible system in place that can deal with that, and it's not obvious that we do.
With regards to Brexit, what may be some of the negative effects of trade in the UK?
Oh, how much time do you have?
We have very little time.
Okay, so sorry to give a sort of academic economist answer here. The answer is it depends, because we don't know what form Brexit is going to take. So let's take one, what seems to be possibly increasing option, which is no deal. It will have big negative effects on a bunch of industries. The industries it will have a big effect on in the first instance are the ones that trade a lot with the EU, because that's where we're increasing costs with the EU a lot, the ones where we're closely engaged in global value chains with the EU. So think automobiles, think pharmaceuticals, think textiles, but also think lots of food and agriculture and processing. Obviously, that will depend on what tariffs the UK government decides to put into place should we leave with no deal. But I'm afraid the answer is the effects will be bad-ish, right? There's going to be a negative impact. This isn't Project Fear. This is, kind of all economists agree on this. But actually detailing, which sector is really going to be affected, we don't know, because we really don't know what's going to happen.
It's worth joining that up to the previous question that I was just busy agreeing with, which is a really good case study, okay? So what's the policy response to what looks like trade deliberalisation via no deal? You definitely don't want a response focused just on the trade, because what you've got is a massive demand shock going on. Okay, so everyone's getting stuffed in the short term. Yes, in the long term, there's going to be sector-specific better and worse outcomes, but you've got, whether it's a recession or not doesn't really matter. You've got a broader demand problem, and your policy response has got to be focused on that. Otherwise, you kind of cause yourself a macroeconomic problem while you go and sort out your little micro stuff on the side, and that is bonkers.
Okay. David, I've got two other questions, and I'm going to have to shut my eyes thereafter, I'm afraid.
One paradox which I noticed was that the biggest gainers from trade are the low-income consumers, and the biggest losers from trade are the low-skilled workers. But of course, the low-skilled workers are the people who have the low incomes. So I wonder whether the problem is as much perception as it is winners and losers, because they're the same people. And the person who is in a low-income job because his wages have been depressed by trade, or indeed by immigration, doesn't realize, because it's diffuse, that he is also, or she, is also gaining from the low price of goods, which is also the result of exactly the same policy decisions. So it's a political issue. And just one other political issue. A lot of the debate over Brexit at the regional level was about decline, and it's Europe's fault that there's been a decline. But a lot of the debate at political level has really been between those who would prefer to have a close alignment with the United States for reasons which have to do with trade, but also have other political reasons, and those who would rather have close relations with Europe as a way of defending ourselves against the US.
Okay, two questions there. Torsten, do you want to?
I can just say something quickly on the, as you said, low-income consumers gaining, but on the other hand, low-skilled jobs losing. I think that's true, and I think it sort of illustrates the point that gainers tend to be quite dispersed, and you might not notice so much that you're a gainer from trade, whereas losers, it can be really concentrated, and you really do feel the hit. So as a low-income consumer, you might not even notice that you're gaining from lower prices, but you would notice if you lost your job.
Yeah, so I agree with that. I don't agree with the first part of your question, because if you were living in Merthyr in the 1980s, the fact that you had some slightly cheaper goods didn't really help you, because everyone was out of work. So that was, let's be really careful about equivalence between differences of effects. Now, I have got to answer your second question, but I've forgotten it. What was your second question?
Why don't we move on? It was a big general question about the US.
Oh, the US. No, that wasn't. Sorry.
So one question here, and the gentleman at the back. I'm just going to come to you. I've got you booked for the. Why don't you shout out your question? I'll come to you in a second. So, for the record, the question was, where do we fit into the world where it's dominated by particular blocks, China, the US, and is Europe even too small, let alone the UK?
Okay, so another nice small question. Thanks for that. Actually, to my mind, that question is linked to David's question earlier about how much scope there is for further liberalisation. The bloc that we want to liberalise with or be part of, or rather, if we want to so let me put that slightly differently. Blocs are increasingly liberalising more deeply. It's not just about tariffs, it's about non-tariff bans and regulations. If we want to stay closely integrated with the EU bloc, then we don't have much choice with regard to the extent to which we can liberalise with other blocs. We can liberalise a bit, but probably fairly shallowly. So there are some hard choices to be made.
Well, I think your question is actually the answer to the second question just now, which is, we are talking here about winners and losers in a micro sense, and do we make this trade policy for that? Really what we're facing is these are geopolitical choices about kind of how do we see ourselves in the world for the next kind of 100 years. So economics is really important. It's all we work on as an institution, but it's not everything, and it is much more tied up with those longer term issues than it is. Purely personally, I don't think we have any option. I mean, look, what was the lesson from the 50s and the 60s? Once you are out, your attempt to have because you cannot be in more than one block, basically, because of the need to have the shared level of deep regulatory alignment, that you end up forced back into choosing. And that is and that we should probably have in the discussion at the level of geopolitics. It's not really about whether it has an effect on a particular company or an effect on anything else for the bit. Never mind.
Okay.
Can I,
All right,
sorry,
10 seconds.
I can't resist coming in on this. I completely agree with Torsten that we're facing some important geopolitical choices. Let me make a vain effort to say, at least let's try and make those in some sense evidence-based. And again, going back to your earlier question about some of the concerns about Brexit, was blaming the EU for some of these dislocations that we've seen. If there is another message that emerges from this paper is, yes, trade does cause some dislocations, but actually many of the dislocations, the higher proportion of the dislocations that we've seen over the last 15 or 20 years in the UK have not been caused by trade. And let's not blame trade for everything.
Or the European Union. The most patient man.
Or the European Union.
Last question.
Thank you. Saadi Hussain. I'm an SME co-founder in medtech, which is one of the sort of leading edge industry sectors that are the winners. What I've noticed is that some of the leading edge technology sectors are already jumping to the next phase using artificial intelligence. We're looking at that. I haven't seen anything in trade policy that will be looking at AI. For example, 10 years ago when we first started, we had a number of highly educated programmers and coders. Now we probably have half of that because we're just implementing AI. And I think that's going to be a massive disruption across all sectors, not just in medtech, but in banking. We've already seen Deutsche Bank are closing their equities department down, partly to do with AI, and there's other sectors that will be affected. And I think that's something that policymakers have to look at seriously. It's not a long-term thing. I think it's a short term. We're looking at between 3 to 5 years where a real job will be lost and it will never come back. And this is something that I think is missing from this report.
Okay,
I don't know if you want to say that.
Michael?
Yeah.
Last comment?
I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I think that future disruption is going to be and future changes are going to be very closely linked to rise in AI and globotics, which is why I explicitly referred to that in my presentation earlier. And I don't think we've yet worked out exactly how we're going to deal with that. 2 comments with regard to that. The first is that this is not a trade phenomenon. Okay? This is the way, these are some deep structural changes and tech changes that are taking place in advanced, not just advanced, but particularly in advanced economies, that are going to have major transformational change and impact on labour markets and on jobs. I don't know what the time scale is, whether this is medium run or long run. That, in a sense, that's not the issue. The issue is that I agree with that. There are trade-related aspects to this, because a lot of that AI, a lot of those emerging technologies are to do with services trade, and it's the way services trade links into manufactured trade. So there are trade policies around that we are starting to deal with and address, but really wasn't the subject of this report. So I'm very sympathetic to what you say, and yes, it's an issue that people are thinking about.
Julia, Torsten, and last comment?
Let's not wander off into an AI discussion.
Okay. All right, well, thank you very much for all coming. Thank you for excellent questions. Thank you to Torsten, Bell, Julia, Mangton, Garrett, and Michael Gaziere. Thank you.